Okay, so the title of my talk is Buddhism and Engaged Citizenship. And in this talk, as you see in the title, I would like to think about a little bit of a social and political dimension of Buddhist teaching, and then how it can get connected with a wisdom-oriented education. So what does engaged citizenship require? How would Buddhist teaching engage with a democratic society? This presentation considers a possible role that Buddhist teaching can play in envisioning a more equitable and inclusive society, with the understanding that a fundamental power of change comes from education, both in formal and informal ways. And I think that is one of the idea of this conference, wisdom-oriented education. So in this presentation, I examine some of the basic ideas of democracy and their pitfalls, their problems, and then Buddhist approach to these problems by taking the example of human rights discourse. And I will also think about the different ideas of wisdom, because we are thinking about the wisdom-oriented education, and I would like to think about what we mean by wisdom and what different ideas of wisdom we can think about. And I will conclude my talk by considering some of fundamental conditions we need to keep in mind in envisioning wisdom-oriented education. So I will start with a kind of the case which might not be relevant to those people who are outside of US, but I think it will give you some idea about the kind of problem we face in democracy. So in the landmark US Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the US Supreme Court ruled that the segregation in public schools violates the constitutionally guaranteed equal protection by the law of the US citizens, and ordered the termination of the segregation in public schools. As I mentioned before, that this might not sound like a big thing for people outside of US, but this is one of the deciding moment, which really shows the kind of racism in America and how to kind of terminate that the racism. Now, 14th Amendment of the US Constitution that proclaimed equal protection by the law passed in 1868. Now, this Supreme Court case happened in 1954. In other words, it took more than 80 years to end the segregation in public schools, even after the law confirmed the equality of US citizens and allowing the children of colored people to suffer from the extremely poor educational condition compared to white children. Now, this is an example of how democracy functions, but at the same time malfunction. Democracy, together with the ideas of equality, fairness, and freedom, and constitutionalism, have been understood as a most desirable form of social structure in our time. However, in order for democracy to function as it was designed to do, fundamental elements in democracy needs to be ready to play their roles. Democracy, by definition, means the rule, kritia, by the people, demo. But who are the people of the democracy? And should the rule by the people be necessarily better than, say, the rule by an individual or monarchy? We usually trace back to Greek society about the origin of democracy. But even at the time, the beginning of democracy, the people did not mean everybody. The people did not include slaves nor women. In modern time, the modern nation state emerged with a promise to offer freedom and equality to all the members of the nation state. This promise, however, has yet to be realized. Even today, this idea of freedom and equality to all the members of the nation state is not being realized. At the dawn of the modern time, the bourgeoisie that demanded equality of all beings against the aristocrats who had enjoyed inherited wealth and social status. Against such a practice, the newly emerged bourgeoisie, with their newly accumulated wealth after the Industrial Revolution, claimed the equality of all beings, be they an aristocrat or a bourgeoisie. In other words, this kind of new group of citizens trying to demonstrate that whether you are a wealthy, privileged aristocrat or a bourgeois, we are equal. So they wanted to demonstrate this. All beings, however, did not include everybody, but excluded factory workers, those who do not have, women, and so on and so forth. In other words, socially marginalized people were again excluded in this demand for equality for all, and the nation state created its own hierarchical social structure, which continues even nowadays. Now, this is actually the reality of democracy in our time. And interestingly, if you look at modern East Asian thinkers, there were philosophers who actually made a connection between these problems of democracy and political system and social issues with a Western mode of thinking, especially Western logic. One such figure was Park Chiu in Korea. So Park Chiu was the first generation Korean philosopher who learned philosophy, Western philosophy, as an academic discipline. And he kind of challenges Western formal logic as a problem. So if you think about the foundational logic of Western philosophy, it consists of the Aristotelian proposals of identity, contradiction, and excluded middle. So this formal logic is based on the idea that each entity, each being is independent and has a separate identity, which cannot overlap with others. So let's try to understand this structure by using an example of a rose. So first level, a rose is a rose. This is identity principle. And then the second layer, it says a rose cannot be the same with a non-rose, say water. Rose is not water. It might sound right, but I will show the problem. If one says a rose is a rose and also water, this statement constitutes a contradiction, so you cannot say that. Now, stay away from this Western formal logic and try to understand a rose from Buddhist perspective. We all know that in Buddhism, nothing has an independent entity, independent essence, and everything is a result of conditions and causes. So a rose is a rose, obviously, but at the same time, a rose is water, sunshine, and soil, and so on and so forth, because a rose needs water to survive, and it also needs sunshine, and it needs to grow in a soil, and so on. In other words, a rose is a rose, and at the same time is water, sunshine, and other things from Buddhist perspective. Now, here you see clearly different mode of thinking. Now, how is this related to any kind of social issues? Park Chiu actually make a connection between the two, this idea of logic and the social problem. Park says, quote, the one-to-one of the formal logic is possible only when this one is an abstract concept. But when applied to reality, the one-to-one is completely impotent. And the quote, that is because 1 + 1 for Park does not always make 2. The bourgeois 1 and the factory workers 1 are not the same because their power is different. The illusion of the logic of 1 is equal to 1 is, Park argues, what makes the totalitarian fascism in Europe possible. And that this is the source of one of the source of problems in a democratic society, as I kind of trying to explain to you by using the case of Supreme Court case in the United States. Now, understanding the idea that an individual cannot be just an individual, but the combination of all these different factors that make contribution to the existence of that individual, Bach declares, quote, I am a plural singular, end quote. This is exactly Buddhist idea of no self, right? One's existence becomes possible because of diverse factors that make contribution to the existence. The Western formal logic that takes only singular deviates from the occurrences in real world, in which each being is more than just an independent and individual entity. Against the theory-oriented formal logic, Pak Chiu proposes a kind of what he calls a relational relationship or engaged relationship among the beings, through which one can see reality as a living situation instead of a dead one. And this is a kind of mode of engagement. Like when you apply the formal logic one-to-one, there is a fixed the kind of identity. Whereas if you really begin to engage with the situation, you kind of get a different relationship. So he gives an example of a rundown house. When you encounter a rundown house, if you just see it as an object, that one, you would say that, oh, there is a house which is broken down. However, Pak Chiu says that if you really look at this house, rundown house, from an engaged perspective, and you should be able to see the hardship of the people living in the house, living in that rundown house, by just encountering the house. Even further, by encountering a rundown house, you should be able to see the problem of the society which allow its members to live in that kind of condition. So these kind of examples shows us that the kind of difference that one can have a relationship with the external reality, depending on what kind of logic we are using, we are employing. And another Korean philosopher in modern time, Baek Sung-wook, even moves further from there. Baek Sung-wook was the first generation of modern Korean Buddhist monk who studied Western philosophy in Europe, in Germany. Because he studied in Germany, studied Western philosophy, he constantly made a comparison between Buddhism and Western philosophy. And he asked himself, what are the characteristics of Buddhist philosophy? And he says that Buddhist philosophy is distinctive from its Western counterpart because Buddhism emphasizes personal practice. In other words, personal practice, which requires embodiment, 자증 in Korean, embodiment of philosophy in one's life. And this is important fact for us because in Western philosophy, usually philosophy is about ideas, whereas whether you apply that ideas to your life is individual's choice. On the other hand, what Baek is saying here is that for Buddhism, the Buddhist philosophy is a combination of ideas, Buddhist teaching, plus how one actually practices that teaching. So the dimension of practice or action is a characteristic of Buddhism that distinguishes the tradition from Western counterpart, Western philosophy. And this is a really important distinction that we need to keep in mind when you think about the difference between a Western philosophy and Buddhist philosophy. He also talked about the Western logic and how Buddhist logic would approach social issues differently. And against this Aristotelian logic of identity, excluded middle, and contradiction, which I explained before, he uses Buddhist what is known as four-cornered logic, cactus critique, and he kind of give an example of equality. So when you think about equality, we usually are so accustomed to a common sense idea of a bipolar approach to this idea, equality versus inequality. And obviously, equality is good and inequality is bad. Baek Sung-wook approaches it differently from Buddhist perspective. So here is different kind of stage. First, equality is equality. This is the same as the first layer, same as Aristotelian logic. This is the case, at least in theory, he says. In theory, we can say equality is equality. And in view of human nature, because human being tends to like to have an equality in a society. However, second level is that equality is not equality. This is Buddhist logic. That is because where there is no inequality, there cannot be equality. In other words, when we think about equality, we are already encountering inequality. If there is no inequality, we don't have to think about equality. So equality is not equality. Third, equality is neither equality nor inequality. In other words, if one were to realize equality, they must assert that equality amounts to inequality and that inequality amounts to equality. Because if you emphasize equality without being aware of inequality, that becomes an essence of inequality, which does not make sense from Buddhist perspective. So equality is neither equality nor inequality. Now, if we look at these three stages, then we see that this is really common, very common Buddhist idea of identity. Buddhist identity is based on interconnected things, interconnectedness of everything. So in Buddhist sutras, Buddhist texts, we find a lot of this kind of explanations. I chose Canons, 6 platform sutra. And then here you see this passage quote, darkness is not darkness by itself. Because there is light, there is darkness. Darkness is not darkness by itself. With light, darkness changes. And with darkness, light is revealed. Each mutually causes the other. If you kind of replace darkness and light with equality and inequality, the idea is the same. And not only Chan Buddhism, Hawaiian Buddhism also use a lot of this kind of a complementary identity, and Hawaiian Buddhism call it mutual identity and mutual penetration. Now, when we think about light and darkness and say that they are mutually interconnected, it's relatively easy to persuade people. But when we apply this idea of interconnectedness to social issues or moral values, we really encounter a rather delicate situation because of a clear preference of right and equality over wrong and inequality. In other words, if you tell people that equality and inequality, they are mutually connected, people really feel hesitance because people think that equality should be better than inequality. Same the case with the right and wrong. And Baek Sung-wook make a very interesting and important comment on this situation. He says, quote, that equality is neither equality nor inequality, is the final line of defense against extremism, end quote. In other words, we know that the bad thing or negative thing needed to be checked. But we tend to think that good things should be always good. But what Baek Sung-wook says, and what Buddhism actually says, is that virtue needed to be checked as much as vice. And this is another important message we think about when you think about the wisdom-oriented education. Now, I try to kind of make a connection of Buddhist idea and then the Buddhist Asian thinkers' idea of Buddhism and how that can be connected with some of social issues. Now, I'd like to use the idea of or the human rights discourse as an example case study of Buddhist engagement with social issues. Since the promulgation of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights in 1948, the human rights discourse is gaining increasing attention, and it's getting more and more important as the world is experiencing a lot of refugee issues and violence and so on and so forth. However, Buddhism has been critical about some of the human rights discourse. And there are a lot of different kind of responses to human rights discourse from Buddhism's perspective, but I just selected 3 issues here, which are relevant to our discussion today. The first one that Buddhism is kind of critical about the human rights discourse is that human rights discourse is based on individualism. In other words, I have a right. So this I as an individual subject who is the owner of a right kind of promote individualism, which is Buddhism trying to dissuade. The second problem is that emphasis of rights without corresponding emphasis on responsibilities. In other words, when people say I, the subject, have a right to do and right to that, because of emphasis is on the self, the kind of the accompanying responsibilities become ignored. And that situation is getting worse and worse. And third problem from Buddhist perspective is an adversarial nature of the rights discourse. Because people say, I have a right to do this or that, this I is understood as opposed to others. And the relationship between I and others is really adversarial. So claiming my right hampers one's capacity to understand others with empathy, and social relationship turns hostile, which is opposite of what Bakchiu explained through relational engaged relationship. But if we really look at the original or the text of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights of 1948, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not say that I or you have a right to do or to that. The expression is not I or you, but it states everybody. Everybody has a right to do this or right to do that. In other words, the foundational idea is equality of all beings, not to give priority to the individualistic approach to rights. Now, then how would Buddhism remedy this kind of problems? One of the proposal was proposed by J. Garfield, a well-known Indian Buddhist scholar. In his article, Human Rights and Compassion, he proposes that compassion should be the foundation of human rights discourse. And he explained this by kind of tracing back to the origin of human rights discourse. When human rights discourse emerged during the Enlightenment period in Europe, the modern liberal moral theory, they made a distinction between the private and the public. And moral cultivation belongs to the private domain, which liberalism refuses to interfere in order to protect the private life. This distinction between public and private is so strong in Western discourse. So individuals' moral cultivation, from a liberalist perspective, individuals' moral cultivation belongs to private life. However, Garfield says that individuals' moral cultivation cannot be a private issue, since it has a direct impact on the person's well-being that cannot be separate from the well-being of the society in which the person exists. So Garfield suggests that we adopt, quote, compassion as the foundation of our moral outlook and try to reconstruct what we can of a liberal account of rights and duties upon that foundation. So this is one of the proposals Buddhism getting engaged with, and compassion cannot be separated from wisdom. Now, the obstacle of such a kind of proposal from Buddhist perspective or non-Western perspective is clear. Incorporating the ideas from the Asian tradition within the right discourse, which have existed for several hundred years in the West, is not an easy task. That is especially the case given the power dynamic between the East and the West. Fortunately, some of the scholars or professors who are teaching courses on human rights in the US make efforts to address the concerns expressed from the non-Western traditions regarding the human rights, like the idea of compassion or moral cultivation should be part of human rights discourse. But the trend, such a kind of trend is still a minority position. And I'm hoping that more and more American scholars, American professors incorporate this non-Western kind of suggestions to improve the human rights discourse. Now, so the kind of examples I offered you so far, the efforts that have been made by Buddhist or Asian thinkers, Bakchiu, Baek-Sung-ok, or Garfield, provide us a glimpse of what wisdom-based education should and could look like. In other words, so here we have to think about wisdom itself. We are thinking about the wisdom-oriented education, but what is wisdom? How do we define wisdom? Now, from Buddhist perspective, this might sound clear. Wisdom is one of the two wings of Buddhism, the other being compassion. Wisdom in Buddhism is a capacity to understand the reality of existence, that things do not exist as independent entities, but exist through multi-layer causes and conditions, and thus are interconnected and empty. So this is a Buddhist kind of concept of wisdom. But wisdom is also the kind of major concept in Western philosophy. The expression philosophy itself, etymologically, means the love of wisdom. Is wisdom in Western philosophical tradition the same as Buddhist wisdom? We have to think about this when you think about the wisdom-oriented education. Now, how about other field? Here, I'm kind of presenting you the idea in data science. Nowadays, everything is technology-driven. And in the data science, what is known as DIKW pyramid or wisdom hierarchy is very well known for a while now. Here you see a triangle in which in this triangle, the widest part of the bottom is located data. From data, we create information. From information, we create a knowledge. From knowledge, we create a wisdom. The kind of idea itself sounds logical, but then what kind of wisdom do they have in mind when the data scientists and people are talking about this, right? So there are several kind of origins of this kind of wisdom hierarchy, and one of the such source was T.S. Eliot's 1934 play poem called titled "The Rock." This one is a similar ambience as the 1922 The Wasteland kind of ambience, but here at the very beginning, Eliot says this quote: "Where is the life we lost in living? Where is the wisdom that we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge that we have lost in information?" So once again, when you think about the wisdom-oriented education, obviously we are not we are challenging the knowledge acquisition-based education, but what is our concept of wisdom, right? Another basis of this, the wisdom hierarchy is from a very short article called "From Data to Wisdom" by the philosopher of science, Russell Eckhoff. And in his very short essay, he kind of defined these 4 items like follows: data as symbols that represent properties of objects and events. Information is processed data. Knowledge answers to how-to questions. And wisdom deals with values. It involves the exercise of judgment. Now, I mean, still it's not clear what they mean by wisdom, but we can clearly see now the kind of the differences between data and wisdom. From data, as we move from data to information, from information to knowledge, from knowledge to wisdom, we see that there are some kind of differences. From data to wisdom, meaning and value increase. Data are algorithmic and programmable, and then as we move from data to wisdom, such possibilities diminish. And wisdom, because wisdom is non-algorithmic and non-programmable, but wisdom has a heavy dependency on human agency. In other words, the human beings' kind of function increases as you move from data to wisdom, and this human agency means the human cultivation, I would say. So in a way, the wisdom is connected with cultivation, and wisdom is also an action. One cannot simply possess wisdom without embodying it. One can possess data, but one cannot possess wisdom. So then I think this kind of brings us together, puts things together from all your ideas that I presented. Baek Sung-wook mentioned that Buddhism requires direct experience and embodiment of wisdom. Park Chi-woo mentioned that philosophy means action and relational relationship with the reality at hand. And Jay Garfield emphasized compassion as the foundation of the right discourse. So here I would like to borrow, by putting them together, I would like to borrow an idea from Joseph Chan, who's actually the professor at the University of Hong Kong. In his book, in which he kind of discussed together Confucianism and liberal democracy, he makes this statement: modern society focuses on civic education, but ignores moral education, which means that modern society trains people to be good citizens, but not necessarily good human beings. But good human beings obviously are needed in order for good citizens to exist. So he said, quote, "A humanity-based moral education seems more effective than a citizenship-based civic education in instilling the virtues that promote the health of democratic institutions and processes," end quote. And he says, when political leaders are not good, citizens can sanction them through elections and other constitutional devices. But if the citizens themselves are not good, elections do not change this. So I'd like to borrow this idea about the importance of moral education, importance of creating a good human beings, but I would also add that the good citizenship is important, right? So to conclude, in a way that wisdom-oriented education of Buddhism should not limit the idea of wisdom to the Buddhist tradition, but should engage itself with the various concepts of wisdom, Buddhist wisdom, Western philosophical wisdom, or even the data science. The characteristics of Buddhist teaching, such as wisdom as action, embodiment of teaching, and compassion, should be incorporated into the education. And such an education should also consider the social demands of Buddhist teachings, engaging with current issues and technology. Buddhism has been weak in social political philosophy. And I think that Buddhism has a lot of potential to develop this idea. And wisdom-oriented education should consider these dimensions of Buddhist teaching. In a context in which Western form of education has been employed as a default educational structure around the world, the differences between the East and the West need to be clearly addressed, as well as their compatibility, so that East can make its own contribution to this current educational system. But at the same time, the power dynamics between East and the West, that is always a part of educational structure and the contents of education, should also be addressed. Thank you.